In the shimmering dawn over the Nile, the palace of the pharaoh blazed like a mirage, a world of gold, incense, and silence so deep it could almost be mistaken for holiness. Yet beneath that radiant facade, behind the towering columns and perfumed halls, existed a world more treacherous than any battlefield. To serve the pharaoh was to live inside the beating heart of godhood itself, and to survive there meant knowing when to kneel, when to vanish, and when to betray. The soldiers who fought Egypt's wars faced spears and arrows. Those within the inner court faced whispers, glances, and the slow poison of envy. The pharaoh was not just a king, he was the embodiment of divine order, Ma'at, the living son of Ra, whose breath kept the sun rising and whose anger could summon famine. To defy him was not rebellion but sacrilege, and yet, within the glittering labyrinth of his palace, defiance was inevitable. Each servant, priest, and advisor carried secrets that could end a dynasty. Every gesture was watched, every word weighed. In the court of a god, silence was safety. Imagine the palace at dusk, walls painted with eternal gods staring down, the floor polished until it reflected the stars. Musicians played softly while eunuchs carried scented oils, and the high priest recited blessings that promised the pharaoh's immortality. But even then, beneath the steady rhythm of ceremony, something darker moved, ambition, lust, and fear entwined like serpents. A single accusation could end not just a life but erase a name from history, condemned to eternal darkness. Inside this golden cage, the boundary between worship and survival blurred until even the most loyal heart could no longer tell the difference. The inner court was a theater of masks. Smiles hid daggers. Flattery was a language of war. The pharaoh himself, worshipped as divine, was trapped in his own sanctity. He could not show weakness, love openly, or trust freely. His wives watched him with devotion edged in rivalry. His vizier, the keeper of his secrets, measured every heartbeat for signs of favor or doom. Priests whispered that the gods spoke only through them. Guards stood in perfect stillness, trained to kill without hesitation if the order came, sometimes against those they had just sworn to protect. Beyond the palace gates, the world was harsh but predictable: floods, crops, battles, and laws. Inside the palace, danger was invisible, silent, and far more elegant. Death came in the form of a sweet-smelling cup of wine, a jealous concubine's curse, or a word whispered in the pharaoh's ear at the wrong moment. This was Egypt's truest battlefield, where power was not seized with swords but with secrets. The very structure of the palace reflected this paradox. The outer courtyards welcomed visitors, priests, and envoys, places of ceremony and illusion. But the deeper one ventured inward, the narrower and darker the corridors became, leading toward the sanctum where the pharaoh lived almost as a god in isolation. Only a chosen few were permitted beyond those walls, and every one of them understood that entry was both a privilege and a death sentence in waiting. For outsiders, the pharaoh's court appeared serene and eternal. Yet to those who served within, it was a living labyrinth of divine paranoia. Loyalty meant nothing if it was not seen. Faith meant little if it did not serve. Even the most trusted could fall to suspicion overnight. History remembers the glory of Egypt, the pyramids, the temples, the eternal order of kings, but hidden behind those marvels was a truth too dangerous to carve into stone, that the throne of the gods was surrounded not by devotion, but by fear. In this sacred prison, power was the only true currency, and devotion was its disguise. The closer one stood to the divine, the more fragile life became. This was not just the story of Egypt's rulers, it was the story of humanity's oldest temptation, the desire to touch godhood and the price paid for daring to stand too close to it. Power in ancient Egypt was not merely political, it was sacred, unchallengeable, and woven into the very fabric of existence. To the Egyptian mind, the pharaoh was not a man ruling over men, but the earthly vessel of divine order itself. His heartbeat was the pulse of Ma'at, the eternal balance between chaos and creation. Yet that divine illusion came with a price. When power is sacred, it cannot be questioned. When it cannot be questioned, it becomes haunted. Inside the golden heart of Egypt's empire, the pharaoh's godhood made him untouchable, and everyone around him expendable. The moment a man or woman stepped into the royal court, they entered a realm governed by theology as much as fear. The pharaoh's word was not simply law, it was cosmic truth. His decrees shaped the moral order of heaven and earth. A bow made too late, an eye contact held too long, could be seen as rebellion against the divine. Servants learned to walk without sound, to breathe without being noticed. For the closer one drew to the divine flame, the more dangerous its light became. Ambition was the most common form of suicide in the pharaoh's world. This system of sacred kingship had begun thousands of years before, in the earliest dynasties when Egypt first united under a single crown. The pharaoh's role was defined as the living Horus, the falcon god who ruled the skies. Upon death, he became Osiris, lord of the underworld, and his heir became the new Horus in an unbroken chain of divine inheritance. It was a breathtakingly elegant idea, until human nature entered the equation. Beneath the rituals and hymns, the truth was simple: godhood could be claimed, and thus it could be stolen. Every priest, vizier, and royal relative understood that to challenge a pharaoh was heresy, but to replace one was destiny. The line between the two was razor-thin. The aura of holiness did not protect the throne. It poisoned it with paranoia. Each pharaoh ruled in the shadow of betrayal, haunted by the knowledge that the same divine authority that crowned him could justify his murder. The priests who anointed him were also the ones who could declare him unworthy of the gods. The walls of the temple whispered with politics as much as prayers. Historical records show that many of Egypt's rulers died not in glorious conquest but in silence, betrayed within their own sanctuaries. Inscriptions speak carefully of divine ascensions and transitions, but the truth behind those words was often violent. Servants found strangled, advisors erased from tomb walls, viziers suddenly vanished from history. These erasures were not mistakes, they were deliberate acts of purification. To be condemned by the pharaoh was to be denied eternity itself, erased from both memory and the afterlife. That fear ensured obedience far more effectively than the whip or the sword ever could. The priests of Ammonius understood this better than anyone. Their power was spiritual, but it reached deep into the machinery of politics. They proclaimed that the pharaoh's soul was tied to the will of the gods, and who but they could interpret that will? The result was an empire balanced on manipulation and ritual, where the favor of the gods could be bought, staged, or stolen. The inner court became a temple of performance, loyalty displayed like worship, deceit hidden behind offerings and hymns. The pharaoh appeared to stand above it all, divine and serene, yet every breath he took depended on those who feared him most. Even within the royal family, divinity created monsters. Royal sons and daughters were not raised as children but as symbols of eternal order. Marriages were made not for love but for purity of blood, an attempt to preserve the essence of the gods within mortal veins. Yet the more sacred the bloodline became, the more it was stained by suspicion. Brothers turned against brothers, mothers plotted for their sons. The court became a breeding ground for divine paranoia, each heart convinced that the throne was its rightful inheritance. Consider the story of Thutmose III and his stepmother, the formidable Hatshepsut. She ruled as pharaoh in his youth, donning the false beard and titles of a man, claiming the divine right to rule in her own name. When Thutmose finally took the throne, he erased her name from every monument and temple wall. To history, it appeared as vengeance, but in truth, it was necessity. To let her name remain would have been to admit that the divine could be shared, and such a concept was heresy. In the world of the pharaohs, godhood could have only one face at a time. In this crucible of sanctity and fear, the pharaoh's court became the most lethal place in Egypt. Soldiers at the borders knew their enemies. Courtiers in the palace did not. One wrong word could be interpreted as sacrilege, one moment of hesitation as betrayal. Death came not as an execution but as a purification, cleansing the divine realm of those who had strayed too near its light. The paradox of the pharaoh's world was complete. The same faith that made him immortal made his throne mortal. To be chosen by the gods was to be cursed with isolation. To serve him was to dance upon the knife's edge of devotion and destruction. Egypt's wars may have been fought with bronze and chariots, But the true battlefield lay in the silent corridors of the inner court, where the gods themselves demanded sacrifice, and every prayer was a weapon. It began as most great betrayals do, in silence. The palace of Pharaoh Ramesses III, the last great ruler of Egypt's golden age, was a fortress of splendor, glittering with cedar columns, ivory furniture, and walls painted in the eternal hues of the gods. But beneath the perfume and gold, shadows moved. Servants whispered. Eyes lingered too long. And behind the lattice screens of the royal harem, a conspiracy was being born, one that would strike at the heart of the divine order itself. The pharaoh was aging, his glory dimmed by time, his court swollen with intrigue. Years of war had bled the treasury dry, and famine bit into the people's patience. Yet inside the royal harem, abundance still reigned: silk, jewels, music, and the intoxicating scent of lotus oil. Among the dozens of wives and concubines, one woman burned with ambition: Queen Tai, a secondary wife whose son Pentar was not the chosen heir. She looked at her child, royal in blood but denied the crown, and saw injustice. And so, in the silent chambers of the pharaoh's pleasure palace, she began to weave her rebellion. The harem was not merely a place of beauty, it was a labyrinth of politics. Each woman had her attendants, spies, and servants, all loyal to her own cause. The guards who watched them were often eunuchs, trained to hear everything and speak nothing. Letters written in perfumed ink were smuggled out through these servants, their meanings hidden in poetry or prayers. What appeared to be love notes to family outside the palace were, in truth, messages of murder. Through these secret networks, Queen Tai reached priests, scribes, and even members of the military, men who had grown weary of an aging king and hungry for a new order. The plot's details were both brilliant and blasphemous. The conspirators planned to use magic, the forbidden arts, to weaken the pharaoh's defenses. Ancient papyri found centuries later describe spells of confusion meant to dull the senses of guards, charms that could render the royal body vulnerable. Clay figurines of the pharaoh, bound and mutilated, were buried in the sand as part of sympathetic rituals. In the minds of the conspirators, they were not committing treason, they were enacting divine justice. Tai's son Pentar was to replace his father, crowned as the rightful heir by the will of the gods. But betrayal within the house of a living god was never without danger. The harem was a place of isolation, designed to keep secrets in and intruders out. When rumors began to drift through the corridors, they spread like smoke, impossible to contain, impossible to ignore. Some of Tai's letters fell into the wrong hands. A servant was caught whispering a forbidden name. The priests of Ammonius, ever alert to threats against divine order, began to listen. The pharaoh, suspicious and already hardened by decades of deceit, ordered an investigation. What followed was less an inquiry and more a purge. The conspirators were seized, tortured, and interrogated under the watchful eyes of the royal court. In fragments of the surviving judicial papyrus of Turin, the story unfolds with chilling precision. Tai, her son, and dozens of officials, scribes, and guards were named. The trials were conducted in secrecy. There could be no public acknowledgement that a god had nearly been slain. Those found guilty were sentenced to die, by their own hand, a ritual of forced suicide meant to cleanse the offense without defiling the divine court with executions. Pentar, the son who dared dream of kingship, was among them. He was given a choice between dishonor and self-inflicted death. His body, discovered later mummified in agony, still bears the marks of strangulation. The pharaoh survived the conspiracy, but only for a moment. Modern forensic studies of his mummy revealed a deep wound to the throat, a slash clean through the windpipe. The assassination had succeeded, though the state refused to admit it. Official records spoke of his peaceful passing, and the great tomb of Ramesses III was sealed with all the pomp of a divine burial. But beneath the stone and gold, the truth was written in silence. Egypt's god-king had been murdered by his own household. The irony was cruel. The harem, designed to protect the pharaoh's bloodline and ensure his immortality, had become the cradle of his death. The women meant to embody purity and loyalty had conspired to end the very embodiment of divinity. And yet, when one looks closer, it is not simply treachery. It is the inevitable result of a system that made power a sacred inheritance. When godhood is passed through flesh, every womb becomes a battlefield. Inside the tomb of Ramesses III, the walls tell stories of victory, eternal peace, and divine triumph. But nowhere is there mention of Queen Tai or her son, of the letters written in code, or of the bodies dragged through the torchlit halls of judgment. History erased them, as if silence could undo their sin. But their rebellion marked the beginning of the end for the divine monarchy. The aura of untouchable godhood had been pierced, the sanctity of the court defiled. From that moment on, the pharaoh's throne would never again be entirely safe. The harem conspiracy stands as one of the most extraordinary events in ancient history, not just a tale of murder, but a window into the psychology of absolute power. Within those gilded walls, love became a weapon, faith became deception, and the very idea of the sacred was turned against itself. It is a reminder that even gods, once confined in flesh and trapped in palaces of gold, are vulnerable to the oldest force of all, human ambition. He was the pharaoh's shadow, the voice that spoke when the divine remained silent, the architect behind every royal decree, the vizier of Egypt. To outsiders, the vizier was second only to the living God himself, the embodiment of order and justice. His hands shaped the fate of the kingdom, from the harvests of the Nile to the building of temples that pierced the horizon. But within the shimmering corridors of the royal court, the vizier's power was both his crown and his curse. For to know too much of the gods was to stand too close to the fire. The title of vizier was one of the oldest in Egypt, older even than many dynasties. Chosen for wisdom and loyalty, the vizier was expected to embody ma'at, truth, harmony, and balance. He presided over the courts of law, oversaw taxation, managed the construction of tombs and temples, and controlled the kingdom's vast bureaucracy. Every piece of papyrus, every grain shipment, every decree from the palace passed through his hands. Yet in that absolute responsibility lay the seeds of destruction. To hold the pharaoh's trust was to hold a blade that could turn at any moment. Historical inscriptions praise these men as paragons of virtue. Khejemni, the wise counselor of Pharaoh Sneferu-Tahotep, whose maxims still whisper across millennia. Rekhmire, the proud vizier of Thutmose III. Their tombs speak of loyalty, honesty, and service. But behind those carved praises, the truth was far more fragile. Many of these same men ended their lives not in glory, but in disgrace, stripped of titles, their names chiseled off walls, their families erased from the records of eternity. Their crime was not rebellion. It was proximity. To serve a living God was to live within his suspicion. A pharaoh could not be seen to err, for a god made no mistakes. So when crops failed, when temples fell into corruption, when whispers of unrest reached the palace, blame could not ascend upward, it had to descend. And the vizier, who managed all, became the perfect vessel for divine wrath. His fall was not just political necessity, it was ritual purification. By his death, the god-king's perfection was restored. The daily life of a vizier was a study in sacred paranoia. Before dawn, he would bathe and pray, donning fine linen robes, each pleat a symbol of purity. He would enter the hall of justice, where he sat beneath images of Ma'at, her feather of truth hovering over his head as a silent threat. Petitioners from across Egypt, farmers, soldiers, priests, would kneel before him, seeking verdicts and mercy. But each decision carried peril. Too much leniency could be seen as weakness, too much severity as cruelty. Every judgment had to echo the unseen will of the pharaoh, even when that will shifted like desert wind. And when the day ended, his duties were not finished. He would dine in silence, watched by servants trained to observe his mood and report it. He would retire to chambers where even the shadows might listen. In this world of divine monarchy, knowledge was the most dangerous possession. The vizier knew the pharaoh's private dealings, the wealth hidden in temple treasuries, the unrecorded deaths of rivals, the falsified omens used to justify decisions. To keep such secrets was both privilege and peril. Rekhmire's story, preserved in fragments of his tomb at Thebes, speaks volumes. Once the most trusted man in Egypt, he fell suddenly from grace. No inscription records why. His tomb was left unfinished, his name defaced, his image hammered out from the walls. Some scholars believe he was accused of arrogance, of letting his prestige rival that of the pharaoh. Others whisper that he knew too much, perhaps of corruption within the priesthood, or forbidden dealings hidden from the divine gaze. Whatever the truth, he vanished from history not with a rebellion, but with silence. In Egypt, erasure was more final than death. The vizier's curse was this: he could never be loved, only feared. To the pharaoh, he was indispensable. To the priests, he was competition. To the people, he was invisible. The weight of divine bureaucracy crushed the soul, turning even the purest servant into a keeper of secrets and lies. The very symbol of ma'at, balance, became impossible. To serve truth meant to deceive, to protect order meant to betray. In the court of gods, morality was a luxury no man could afford. The psychological toll was immense. Imagine the sleepless nights, the quiet dread of receiving a royal summons at dusk. A messenger from the palace could mean promotion or execution. The vizier's family lived in fear, forbidden from speaking of palace affairs. Even in their homes, they were surrounded by spies disguised as servants. There were no friends in this world, only potential witnesses. And when the time came for the pharaoh to cleanse his court, the vizier was always the first to fall. Some of these men met their ends in ways too cruel to inscribe. A goblet of wine laced with toxin, a swift strangulation in the shadows of a temple, or worse, ritual disgrace, their bodies denied mummification, their souls condemned to wander without name. Yet others chose their own end, seeking peace in death rather than dishonor. The vizier's final act of loyalty was often silence, a confession written in absence. And yet the position never vanished. For even after one vizier fell, another rose to take his place. The machine of divine power demanded it. The pharaoh could not rule alone. His divinity required a mortal intermediary. And so the cycle continued: trust, service, suspicion, destruction. Each generation of viziers learned the same unspoken truth, that to be indispensable to a god is to live forever at the edge of damnation. In the end, the vizier's office became both the spine and the sickness of Egypt's empire. It represented the illusion of balance in a world ruled by absolute power. Beneath the golden mask of divine order, every man in that seat faced the same fate, consumed by the very god he served. The vizier's curse was not written in spells or carved in stone. It lived in the eyes of every pharaoh who ever looked upon his servant and wondered, what happens when the hand that writes my will decides to rewrite it? They were the flowers of the divine garden, adorned in gold, perfumed with myrrh, and veiled in mystery. Yet beneath their beauty, the royal women of Egypt lived lives defined by danger, rivalry, and unrelenting scrutiny. They were wives, mothers, and priestesses, but above all, instruments of dynastic survival. The pharaoh's harem was not a sanctuary of love, it was a battlefield of wombs, where affection was currency and childbirth was war. For in a realm where bloodline determined divinity, a woman's body was both temple and weapon. Within the walls of the palace, the great royal wife reigned supreme. She was the chosen consort of the living god, often depicted beside him in temple carvings, sharing his crown and his glory. Yet her throne was never secure. Behind her, in the dimly lit chambers of the harem, dozens of lesser wives and concubines waited, each praying for the same miracle, to bear the next pharaoh. The court poets sang of divine love between king and queen, but history tells another story, one of envy sharpened by perfume and silk. Marriage in Egypt's royal court was never about passion, it was about control. To keep the blood of the gods pure, pharaohs often married their sisters or half-sisters, an act of sanctity in the eyes of religion but one that bred suffering and madness in private. The union of divine siblings was seen as a mirror of the gods Osiris and Isis, whose sacred bond gave life to the world. But behind that mythic symbolism lay the cold machinery of inheritance. The womb of a royal woman was not her own. It belonged to the state, to the priests, and to the endless cycle of dynastic legitimacy. For the great royal wife, every pregnancy was a public event, a matter of politics and prophecy. The birth of a son meant triumph, security, and near-divine reverence. The birth of a daughter or the death of a child could mean disgrace or demotion. Courtiers whispered, priests murmured, and rivals smiled behind jeweled veils. In a court where omens were interpreted as truth, a single misfortune could be seen as divine displeasure. Many royal women, desperate to preserve their standing, turned to magic, charms, incantations, and secret amulets buried beneath their beds. These were not simple superstitions, but acts of survival in a world where the gods judged through the womb. The consequences of failure were cruel. A woman who lost favor with the pharaoh could be dismissed from court, sent to remote estates, or worse, accused of witchcraft or treason. History's silence hides countless tragedies, but fragments remain. One queen was found mummified without her heart, a punishment reserved for those who betrayed divine order. Another vanished entirely, her name chiseled out of tomb inscriptions, her existence denied. Erasure was the ultimate death, denial not only of life but of the afterlife. For a royal woman, disgrace meant eternal oblivion. And yet, some wielded power with lethal grace. Queen Nefertari, beloved of Ramesses II, was not merely an ornament of the throne. She was its equal, her intelligence woven into the diplomacy and theology of her time. Centuries later, Nefertiti would rise even higher, co-ruling with Akhenaten during Egypt's most radical religious revolution. Her beauty became divine propaganda, her very image used to legitimize a new god. But her fate remains uncertain. Did she die peacefully, or did she vanish in one of the palace purges that followed her husband's heresy? In the court of the pharaohs, a woman's power was never secure. Even queens who stood beside gods could vanish like smoke. The harem itself was both paradise and prison. Guarded by eunuchs and high priests, it was a world apart, filled with music, incense, and quiet dread. The women there were educated in art, poetry, and ritual. They were trained to charm, to listen, and to wait. Some entered willingly, seeking privilege and luxury. Others were offerings from noble families, political gifts meant to strengthen alliances. But once inside, there was no leaving. Every gesture, every glance, was watched. The pharaoh's love was the ultimate blessing, and the ultimate danger. Behind the smiles and ceremonies, rivalries could turn deadly. Poison became the invisible weapon of the harem. A few drops of tainted wine, a perfumed oil laced with venom, a charm hidden in bedding, all could decide the future of a dynasty. The infamous harem conspiracy of Ramesses III was born in such chambers, proving that beneath the gold and incense, ambition burned hotter than devotion. When godhood could be birthed from the womb, even the most devout became willing to kill for it. There was another, darker layer to this world, the spiritual burden placed upon royal women. As wives of the god, many were bound to serve in the temple cults, performing rituals of purification and fertility. They were expected to embody divine energy, to act as vessels through which gods and spirits might communicate. But these rituals often blurred the line between sanctity and servitude. Some rites demanded isolation, fasting, or intimate ceremonial acts that, though sacred in purpose, left the women spiritually hollowed. To be chosen by the gods was an honor, surviving their demands was another matter entirely. In the private chambers of the palace, love itself became a political act. The pharaoh's affection was a currency that could raise a family to prominence or destroy it overnight. A single gesture, a hand held too long, a private smile observed by the wrong eyes, could be twisted into accusation. The harem was a world where emotion was forbidden but omnipresent, where love was both the sweetest poison and the most dangerous prayer. And yet, amid this cruelty, there were moments of humanity. Letters found in tombs reveal tenderness between pharaohs and their queens, soft words of longing, promises of eternity together. These rare glimpses remind us that even in a system built on divine control, the heart remains stubbornly human. But such tenderness was fragile, easily shattered by suspicion. The palace had no place for love that did not serve the throne. In the end, the royal women of Egypt were both victims and architects of power. Their beauty sustained dynasties, their wombs determined gods. Yet every glance, every breath, was shadowed by danger. They lived in splendor unimaginable to the common people, yet their freedom was less than that of a servant. Theirs was a world where adoration could turn to execution overnight, where devotion demanded silence, and where the divine feminine, so celebrated in stone, was often crushed beneath the very godhood it helped sustain. Behind every pharaoh's throne stood a woman who either birthed his power or buried him with it. And though their names are often lost, their presence haunts the golden silence of Egypt's ruins. The great temples, the tombs, the hieroglyphs, all whisper the same truth, that the price of divine love was suffering, and that within the pharaoh's palace, no one paid that price more dearly than his queens. They called them servants of the Hidden One, the priests of Ammonius, the silent architects behind Egypt's divine empire. To the people, they were guardians of faith. To the pharaoh, they were both his voice and his threat. Their temples rose higher than palaces, their coffers heavier than the crown's treasury, their influence woven into every level of the kingdom. Yet beneath their solemn chants and white linen robes lay an institution more dangerous than any army, a sacred power that could enthrone or destroy kings. The rise of the priesthood was not sudden. In the early dynasties, the pharaoh alone was the high priest of every god. He offered sacrifices, led ceremonies, and mediated between mortals and divinity. But as Egypt grew vast and complex, that divine duty had to be delegated. Temples multiplied, rituals expanded, and specialized castes emerged to perform them. By the time of the New Kingdom, the priests of Ammonius, centered in Thebes, had become a kingdom within a kingdom, controlling land, labor, and belief. The god Ammonius had evolved from a local deity into the very essence of hidden power, and his priests became the keepers of that invisibility. To understand their danger, one must first understand their allure. Ammonius was the concealed one, the god who dwelled in mystery, unseen yet all-encompassing. His worship promised transcendence beyond the visible world, a communion not with images, but with the unseen truth of the universe. It was this aura of the invisible that made his priests untouchable. While the pharaoh shone in public splendor, the priests ruled in shadow. Every coronation, every decree, required their blessing. Without their rituals, even the god-king's divine legitimacy was incomplete. In essence, the priests held the keys to eternity. Their wealth was staggering. Vast estates along the Nile were dedicated to Ammonius temples. Farmers plowed not for the crown, but for the god. Ships loaded with gold from Nubia and incense from Punt were sent directly to Thebes. By the reign of Ramesses XI, temple lands accounted for nearly one-third of Egypt's economy. In an empire built on divine hierarchy, this economic dominance meant spiritual blackmail. The pharaoh might be a god, but the priests of Ammonius controlled the gates of heaven. The high priest of Ammonius, often called God's father, wielded authority rivaling that of the pharaoh himself. He commanded thousands of lower priests, singers, and scribes, as well as temple guards trained to enforce sacred law. His word could elevate a man to holiness or condemn him as impure. Yet his power was cloaked in humility, ritual fasting, shaved heads, linen garments. It was the mask of sanctity hiding political ambition. In truth, the priesthood had learned to weaponize faith. By controlling what the gods said, or seemed to say, they could bend kings to their will. Conflicts between pharaoh and priest erupted throughout Egypt's history, though they were rarely recorded openly. Amenhotep IV, later known as Akhenaten, dared to challenge this hidden power. He declared Ammonius' cult corrupt and replaced it with the worship of a single god, Aten, the sun disk. Temples of Ammonius were closed, his name erased from monuments, his priests cast into exile. For a time, it seemed the divine monopoly had been broken. But faith, once institutionalized, cannot be erased by decree. After Akhenaten's death, the priests returned with vengeance, restoring Ammonius' supremacy and erasing the memory of the heretic king. The message was clear: not even a god-king could silence the voice of the Hidden One. Their methods were subtle but devastating. When displeased with the pharaoh, the priests would withhold ritual blessings, claiming that omens were unfavorable or that the gods required atonement. Without divine sanction, a ruler's legitimacy began to rot. Even the most absolute monarch needed the illusion of divine approval. In the grand festivals of Thebes, the statue of Ammonius would be carried from the temple on a sacred boat, paraded before the people. It was said that the god himself would choose his path, turning left or right as a sign of his will. But the priests were the ones who carried the boat. A single shift of their shoulders could determine the fate of a kingdom. There were darker rumors too. Whispered tales of forbidden rituals held deep within temple sanctuaries, where only the highest initiates could enter. It was said that there, in torchlight and incense, the priests communed not with gods but with something older, forces of chaos bound beneath layers of ceremony. Magical papyri describe invocations written in blood, curses meant to bind the tongue of the king, or darken the heart of the ruler. Whether such rites were superstition or political theater mattered little. Their power lay in fear, and fear was the lifeblood of faith. The priests' influence extended into death itself. Mummification, burial rites, and the afterlife economy all flowed through their hands. They decided who was pure enough for eternity, whose name would live, whose would vanish. Even the pharaoh's passage into the next world required their chants, their blessings, their secrecy. Thus, the king's immortality, his very claim to divinity, was held hostage by mortal men in linen robes. It was the ultimate inversion of power. The god ruled the living, but his priests ruled eternity. Over time, their dominance became indistinguishable from tyranny. In the later New Kingdom, the high priests of Ammonius began to claim royal titles themselves. They wore crowns, led armies, and struck coins bearing their own names. The line between temple and throne dissolved. Theocracy consumed monarchy. Egypt, once the land of god-kings, became the land of priest-kings. It was a transformation so complete that even the gods seemed silent before it. Yet the priests paid a price for their ambition. By controlling the divine narrative, they hollowed it. Ritual became repetition, faith became bureaucracy, and the gods themselves began to lose their mystery. The people's devotion waned, and the empire's spirit withered. What had begun as devotion to the divine ended as devotion to power. The priests had mastered control, but in mastering it, they destroyed the awe that made it sacred. In the end, the pharaoh and the priesthood mirrored each other, two halves of the same illusion. The pharaoh claimed to embody divinity, the priests claimed to interpret it. Both were prisoners of a faith too powerful to escape. Their rivalry was not between man and God, but between those who wished to define what God meant. When the temples of Ammonius finally fell into silence, their colossal columns half buried in sand, the echoes of that struggle remained. The hieroglyphs still speak of glory and piety, but between the lines lies the real story, a centuries-long war fought not with armies, but with prayers. A war where the victors crowned themselves in holiness, and the losers vanished beneath the weight of forgotten gods. They called it Heka, the power that shaped the universe, the language through which gods and mortals could command reality itself. To the modern mind, it was magic, but to the ancient Egyptians, Heka was neither illusion nor superstition. It was a divine force, older than the gods, that existed before creation. And in the pharaoh's inner court, where every gesture carried the weight of eternity, Heka was both a weapon and a sentence. Magic in Egypt was not confined to sorcerers in shadowy alleys or village healers muttering incantations. It lived within the very structure of the state. Every priest, physician, and scribe was trained in it. Every temple held scrolls inscribed with forbidden words of power, spells to protect, to curse, to resurrect. The line between religion and magic was non-existent. Where the West would one day divide faith from the occult, the Egyptians saw them as one, divine authority manifest through ritual. For the pharaoh, Heka was his birthright. He was not merely a king but the embodiment of divine order, Ma'at, and thus the ultimate wielder of the world's hidden forces. His coronation was not only a political event but a magical awakening. Priests anointed him with sacred oils, recited ancient names that bound him to the gods, and placed upon his brow the Uraeus serpent, symbol of royal protection. It was said that the serpent could strike down any who threatened the king, not as a metaphor but as a literal act of divine energy. The pharaoh's very words were considered spells. To speak was to command reality. But the same Heka that crowned him also watched him. To misuse it, to break the cosmic balance of Ma'at, was to invite annihilation. This is why the pharaoh's court, glittering with beauty, was so perilous. Every prayer, every ritual, every symbol was bound by rules older than the Nile itself. To violate them, even accidentally, was to risk the wrath of the unseen. The priests who served the pharaoh were not just servants of faith, they were custodians of metaphysical law. Their loyalty was to order, not to the man who wore the crown. Within the palace walls, Heka shaped daily life in ways both magnificent and terrifying. Amulets were placed beneath the pharaoh's bed to protect him from night demons. The air was thick with incense said to repel spirits of decay. Servants whispered protective verses before pouring his wine. At every feast, the food was ritually purified, each dish consecrated, each cup guarded by invisible forces. The closer one stood to the divine, the more dangerous existence became. To live near the pharaoh was to live within a storm of sacred energy, one misstep from favor, one breath from doom. There were secret rituals, too, performed at night in chambers lit only by oil lamps and the flicker of blue flame. These were the rites of rejuvenation, through which the pharaoh renewed his divine essence. Incantations invoked the rebirth of Ra, the daily resurrection of Osiris, and the eternal merging of the king's spirit with the gods. During these ceremonies, sacred statues were anointed, mirrors of silver reflected moonlight onto the pharaoh's flesh, and hieroglyphs of power were drawn in red ochre upon his skin. He was both participant and offering, the god reborn through suffering, the man consumed by the myth he embodied. Yet beneath the beauty of these rites lay fear. For the same magic that gave life could take it. To invoke the gods was to invite their judgment. If the rituals failed, if the symbols were imperfect, or the words mispronounced, the divine energy could turn inward, devouring the one who called upon it. Ancient texts speak of priests who burned from within, after performing forbidden invocations, their bodies untouched by flame yet charred by unseen fire. In the temple libraries, certain scrolls were kept sealed, marked with warnings, words that should not be spoken aloud. The pharaoh's magicians, the Hamu Heka, were the most feared men in Egypt. Their role was to protect the throne from both mortal and spiritual threats. They crafted wax figurines of enemies, bound with cords and buried in desert sands. They recited exorcisms against foreign curses and performed counter-rituals to neutralize hostile spells. But their power was a double-edged sword. Many fell victim to their own arts, consumed by jealousy, paranoia, or the very energies they sought to control. To wield Heka without perfect purity of heart was to open a door that could not be closed. One of the most chilling examples comes from the papyrus Westcar, a text describing magicians who served the pharaoh Khufu. One sorcerer, named Dedi, is said to have decapitated a goose and restored it to life before the king's eyes. Yet even as he performed wonders, his story carried a warning. Dedi predicted the rise of a new royal line that would end Khufu's dynasty. The pharaoh, shaken by the prophecy, realized the truth, that magic could reveal as much as it could destroy. In every spell lay the seed of rebellion. Every miracle whispered of mortality. As centuries passed, the balance between divine and forbidden blurred further. The priests began to collect spells not meant for mortal hands. Incantations to compel gods, to command the dead, to bind demons. These were recorded in what modern scholars call books of the netherworld, grim manuals inscribed on tomb walls and papyri, describing the perilous journey through the afterlife. The pharaoh was guided through lakes of fire and gates guarded by serpents, armed with passwords and charms. In death as in life, his survival depended on the mastery of Heka. Without it, even a god-king could be devoured by chaos. But perhaps the darkest truth of all was psychological. The pharaoh's power was built on belief, his and his subjects. Every ritual reinforced a fragile illusion, that order could be maintained, that divine favor was eternal. The more the system relied on magic, the more it revealed its own fragility. When famine struck or enemies triumphed, the people whispered that the pharaoh had lost his Heka, that his connection to the divine had withered. And so, in times of crisis, the court turned inward, performing ever more elaborate rituals, demanding greater sacrifices, chasing the vanishing shadow of divine power. In the end, Heka was not just a tool, it was a mirror. It reflected the human hunger to control fate, to touch the sacred, to escape death. The pharaoh's magicians, his priests, his courtiers, they all sought mastery over the invisible. Yet in their pursuit of godhood, they became prisoners of the very forces they sought to command. The inner court, saturated with sacred energy, became a crucible of paranoia. Every shadow hinted at curses, every dream a warning. Magic had once promised eternal harmony, but by the twilight of Egypt's empire, it had become a language of fear. The ruins of Thebes still whisper fragments of those forbidden words. In faded hieroglyphs, the stories of power and peril remain, spells to summon gods, to curse kings, to ward off unseen terror. And as scholars decipher them, one truth becomes clear: Heka was never merely a superstition. It was the essence of control, the divine illusion that sustained the empire. It was the unseen weapon of pharaohs and priests alike, and in the end, the poison that undid them both. It began as a whisper and ended in silence. The glory that once radiated from the pharaoh's court was now dimmed, its marble halls echoing with the ghost of grandeur. The scent of incense still lingered, but it could not mask the stench of rot beneath the surface. Egypt, once the realm of living gods, had become a stage haunted by the performance of power. The divine had turned to dust, and mercy had died with it. As the centuries passed, the inner court of the pharaoh evolved into something darker than ritual and intrigue. It became a machine of survival, a theater of masks where cruelty was not a flaw but a form of devotion. Every gesture, every punishment, every death was performed in the name of Ma'at, the sacred order of balance and justice. But when justice becomes sacred, it can no longer recognize compassion. What was once divine harmony had become divine horror. Punishment within the pharaoh's court was never merely retribution, it was purification. The crimes of courtiers, priests, or concubines were seen not as personal failings but as cosmic infections. To cleanse them required suffering, and suffering itself was sanctified. Those accused of betrayal were not simply executed, they were erased. Their names chiseled from monuments, their likenesses defaced, their souls condemned to wander the afterlife without rest. To be forgotten was a fate worse than death, and within the gilded walls of the palace, forgetfulness was a weapon wielded with surgical precision. The punishments varied according to station, but their message was always the same: no one, not even those closest to the god-king, was untouchable. The lowly servant who stole food might lose his tongue for speaking falsehood. A scribe who misrecorded sacred texts could be flayed alive, his skin nailed to the temple wall as a warning. For royal attendants or wives accused of infidelity, the punishments grew more elaborate, designed not only to destroy the body but to terrify the soul. Some were made to swallow ground glass, others were forced to drink boiling resin or face burial alive within the sands of the desert, left for the sun to devour. Even in such cruelty, there was ceremony. Each punishment was accompanied by prayer, as if the act itself were an offering. Priests stood by to chant verses that framed torment as restoration, balancing the scales of Ma'at. To suffer in the name of the gods was to serve them, even in death. It was this ritualization of violence that made the pharaoh's court more dangerous than any battlefield. On the battlefield, a man could die with honor. In the palace, he could die as a symbol. One of the most disturbing practices recorded in fragments of later texts is the ritual of the false rebirth. It was reserved for those who had betrayed the sacred trust of the pharaoh, courtiers, magicians, even priests who had invoked Heka without sanction. The condemned would be wrapped like a mummy, their mouth sealed with wax, their heart symbolically removed. They were then left alive within a tomb chamber for a single night, forced to face their second birth. By dawn, most were dead, either by suffocation or madness. Those who survived were deemed purified, but they rarely spoke again. The ceremony was not about mercy, it was about control. It reminded all who served that the pharaoh could take not only life but identity. Cruelty in the inner court was never chaotic, it was codified. Every act of punishment was documented by scribes, every execution witnessed by priests. These records were then sealed, hidden from public eyes, for to reveal such horrors would break the illusion of divine perfection. Yet the walls themselves seem to remember. Archaeologists have uncovered traces of blood in chambers once thought ceremonial, as well as inscriptions hastily scratched out, their meanings too dark for eternity. Psychologically, the pharaoh's court had become a world without empathy, a closed system where fear replaced morality. Courtiers learned to smile through dread, to flatter those who could destroy them. Loyalty was a performance, silence a survival strategy. Even family bonds meant nothing. Brothers betrayed brothers, sons denounced fathers, and queens plotted against their own children. The pharaoh himself, trapped in the myth of godhood, became increasingly isolated. Surrounded by sycophants and sorcerers, he no longer knew who loved him or who waited for his fall. Power had devoured the human heart. The deification of cruelty reached its zenith during the late dynasties, when pharaohs, desperate to maintain control, turned punishment into spectacle. Executions were staged as rituals of renewal, echoing the myth of Osiris's dismemberment and resurrection. The condemned were paraded as embodiments of chaos, their deaths reenacting the eternal victory of order. Each scream was a prayer, each drop of blood an offering to sustain the illusion that Egypt still stood in divine harmony. The inner court became a theater of terror where gods and men blurred, and suffering itself became a sacred language. But beneath the golden masks and perfumed air, despair festered. The very system that demanded obedience had begun to consume itself. Priests accused other priests of impurity, viziers plotted against their pharaoh, servants poisoned their masters out of desperation or vengeance. The palace became a battlefield of invisible wars, wars fought with whispers, amulets, and dreams. No sword was as deadly as suspicion. Even the gods seemed to tire of it. In the twilight of the new kingdom, Egypt was fractured by famine, corruption, and invasion. The rituals continued, the prayers were recited, but they had lost their meaning. The divine order that had once bound the world together was unraveling. The priests still spoke of Ma'at, but their words rang hollow. The pharaoh still called himself a god, but the people no longer believed. And when faith dies, even magic becomes nothing more than cruelty wearing the mask of holiness. To look upon that era now is to confront the darkest mirror of civilization. The pharaoh's court was not an aberration, it was the logical end of absolute power. When belief and fear become indistinguishable, when mercy is sacrificed for order, the human spirit begins to decay. The Egyptians had once dreamed of eternity, of perfect balance between life and death, man and God. But the pursuit of perfection demanded too much blood. In their quest to preserve divine harmony, they destroyed the very humanity that gave it meaning. The monuments still stand, silent, magnificent, eternal. The temples of Luxor and Karnak, the tombs in the Valley of the Kings, all bear the weight of that contradiction. Their walls depict serenity, triumph, everlasting peace. Yet the air around them hums with what they do not say, the cries, the secrets, the cruelty buried beneath gold leaf and sacred hymns. They are beautiful, yes, but their beauty was paid for in terror. In the end, the death of mercy was not a moment but a transformation. It was the gradual surrender of compassion to control, of spirit to structure, of God to ritual. The pharaoh's inner court had become a living paradox, a paradise built on fear, a sanctuary drenched in blood. And perhaps that is why Egypt's empire, for all its brilliance, could not last forever. No system built on divine cruelty can escape its own curse. The gods may have been immortal, but their worshippers were not. When the last pharaoh fell and the sands began to reclaim the stones, Egypt did not die, it sank into silence. The temples still shimmered beneath the desert sun, the colossal statues still gazed toward eternity, but the voices that once filled them were gone. The songs of devotion, the whispers of intrigue, the cries of punishment, all had been swallowed by time. Yet in that silence, something endured. The legacy of the pharaoh's inner court, its beauty, its terror, its power, remained etched into the human imagination, an eternal reminder that even the divine can decay from within. For over 3,000 years, Egypt's kings ruled with the authority of gods. They built pyramids that defied the horizon, temples to house eternity, and rituals to command the unseen. But beneath that magnificence lay a darker truth. The throne that promised divinity also demanded paranoia. The inner court was not simply a seat of government. It was a theater of faith and fear, where devotion and deceit danced so closely they became indistinguishable. Within those polished halls, humanity played its most ancient game, the battle between power and morality. The ruins tell that story better than words. The mummified throat of Ramesses III, slit by his own household, whispers of betrayal that outlived gold. The judicial papyrus that recorded his conspirators' punishment reads not as divine justice but human vengeance cloaked in holiness. The carved reliefs showing perfect harmony hide the cracks of anxiety beneath the paint. What we call Egypt's divine order was in truth an empire forever on the brink of collapse, sustained only by belief and by fear. The pharaoh's rule depended on illusion, the belief that the king's command was the will of the cosmos. To challenge him was to challenge the universe itself. Every monument, every hymn, every act of cruelty reinforced that sacred deception. The people obeyed not out of loyalty, but terror of chaos. In that sense, the pharaoh was not merely a ruler, he was the embodiment of control. His throne rested not on stone but on psychology. And yet, it was that same psychology that doomed him. When faith becomes obedience, when fear replaces conscience, the sacred begins to rot. The priests who spoke for the gods learned to manipulate divine will. The courtiers who swore loyalty learned to weaponize devotion. What began as worship turned into theater, each ritual more elaborate, each punishment more symbolic. The empire became addicted to its own illusion, unable to tell holiness from horror. Modern eyes might see barbarism, but within their logic lay a twisted kind of beauty. The Egyptians sought not cruelty for its own sake, but permanence, a way to freeze the fleeting, to outwit death. Their monuments, their mummification, their hieroglyphs, all were acts of defiance. They refused to accept oblivion. Every ritual of pain was a prayer for eternity. To the pharaoh's court, suffering purified, order preserved, and remembrance guaranteed survival beyond the grave. Even their cruelty held meaning. The ritual of erasing a name was not just execution, it was annihilation. To remove a man from memory was to erase him from eternity. Such punishments reveal a civilization that believed identity was sacred and that control over remembrance was the highest power of all. It was both genius and tragedy, the realization that eternity could be engineered through terror. But no illusion lasts forever. As Egypt's faith hardened into bureaucracy, its magic became repetition. The gods grew silent. The temples, once alive with chanting, became hollow monuments to a system that had lost its soul. When foreign powers invaded, the Assyrians, Persians, and finally the Greeks, they did not just conquer a land, they conquered a myth already dying. The divine kingship had collapsed long before the armies arrived. It was not the sword that ended Egypt's eternity, it was exhaustion. And yet, their story did not vanish. It lingers in the psychology of power that still defines humanity. Every empire that demands unquestioning faith, every leader who cloaks tyranny in divine purpose, echoes the pharaoh's legacy. The belief that one can command both flesh and fate, that authority itself is sacred, is Egypt's most enduring curse. The pharaoh's inner court may be dust, but its pattern remains: control through awe, obedience through fear, devotion through spectacle. But there is another side to that inheritance, one of awe and creation. The same civilization that weaponized ritual also gave birth to timeless beauty. The same minds that devised cruelty carved the serene face of Nefertiti and wrote hymns to the rising sun. Even in their darkest moments, the Egyptians were driven by the yearning to bridge the mortal and divine. It is that yearning that still captivates us. We gaze upon their ruins not only in horror but in wonder, sensing that we, too, are drawn to eternity, even at terrible cost. Perhaps that is why the pharaoh's story still resonates. It reflects us back to ourselves. The court of gold and blood is gone, yet its logic survives wherever power is worshipped. The desire to control life, to command meaning, to outlast death, these are not ancient obsessions. They are human ones. Every ruler who builds monuments in his own name, every system that sacrifices mercy for order, carries a fragment of that ancient curse. And still, amid the ruins, there is beauty. The hieroglyphs gleam faintly under moonlight, their lines perfect after millennia. The desert wind moves softly through broken columns. Somewhere within that silence lies the most haunting truth of all. Egypt's greatness was never in its power, but in its acceptance of paradox. It understood that to be divine is also to be doomed, that immortality requires sacrifice, that order demands control, and that control, once absolute, becomes death. The pharaohs sought to escape the limits of mortality, and in doing so, became its most vivid reminder. Their monuments endure, but their empire is dust. Their names echo through eternity, but their mercy has long since vanished. In their triumph lies their tragedy. They achieved the impossible but forgot why they wanted it. So, as the sun sets over Luxor and the stones glow with the same fire that once lit a god's court, one question remains. It drifts across the dunes like a whisper from the past, a question no king, no priest, no empire has ever answered. Was it the gods who made man divine, or man who made the gods cruel?